Okay, so today we're going to be learning lesson 58, which is just about percent word problems. So they can be kind of hard to visualize at first, which is why we're going to make some diagrams to help figure out what we're actually solving for in these problems and kind of break them down into easier concepts. I don't really like the diagrams in the book. They are weird and hard to draw. So I'm making squares, and I suggest that you do something similar, whatever's easiest for you that helps you understand what is going on. So for the first problem, Kathy, John, and Susie have only 20 chickens left. If they began with 80 chickens, what percent of the original flock remains? Okay, so before, they had 80 chickens. So we're going to pop that in our before box. That was their total before anything happened. After, they only have 20 chickens left. So I'm going to draw roughly a line right there to kind of split this block up. They lost 20 chickens. But we don't know what percent that is. That's what we actually want to find. So I'm going to just circle that because that's what I actually want to find. Now, my box here, if you look at this after box, they only have 20 left. It's really easy for us to figure out how many they lost. That would be the other part of the box. 80 minus 20 is 60. But we also don't know what percent that is. And this diagram would actually help us solve two different problems. We can either solve 20 chickens is what percent of 80, we can figure that out, or we could solve for 60 is what percent of 80. In this case, we're solving for 20, which is why I circled that percent, because that's the one we actually want to solve for. We want to know what percent remains, what percent of chickens is left. So there are 20 chickens, but that's not a percent. We want to figure out what percent that is. So this sets us right up for our equation, percent over 100 times of equals is. Now remember, you can't just take the percent, like say 60%, and multiply it times your of and your is. You have to make sure that's turned into a decimal, which is why they set it over 100 in your equation. As long as you remember to turn it into a decimal, you're good. So for this, our equation, what percent, we don't know any percents at all, over 100 times of, which is our before box. It was what percent of 80 equals 20. We want to know what percent of 80 is 20. What percent we have left. Now all we have to do is solve for that percent. Instead of multiplying by 80 and dividing by 100, I can multiply by 100 and divide by 80. I'm doing the opposite of the things here. So instead of multiplying by 80, I divided by 80. Instead of dividing by 100, I multiplied by 100. And that will make them all cancel out. So if I multiplied by 100 over 80 on the left, I'm going to have to do the same thing on the right. Multiply it by 100, divide by 80. So then I'm left with what percent equals 20 times 100 over 80. And that's really easy to solve. So I can just write that as what percent equals 2,000 over 80, which is the same as 1,000 over 40, or 100 over 4, which we know to be 25%. So that would be our answer. So that means that we were left with 25% of our original flock. And if I were to take the number 80, our original flock, and multiply that by 25%, or 0.25, I would get the answer of 20 chickens. So I would get that 20 chickens is my 25% of my total. Okay, let's do another example. Example 2. Meme, I guess that's her name. Meme and Jim have 75 thingamabobs. They want to give Hal 20% of them. They really made up some weird names here. How many thingamabobs did they give Hal? Okay, so before, their total number of thingamabobs was 75. That was our before. They gave Hal 20% of them. So we have the same kind of box as before. We can split that into, they gave away 20%. We know that. And because we know that that amount is 20%, we know that the other percent is 80% of it. They still have 80% of their thingamabobs, and they gave away 20%. But we want to know how many did they actually give. They had 75. What is 20% of 75? What is 80% of 75? If we want to know how many they gave Hal, that's the 20%. They gave away 20%. We want to solve for this right here. What number? So that's what we're solving for. We don't really care about this one. So we're going to plug that into our equation. We know the percent that they gave away. They gave away 20%. I'm going to write that as 0.2. My of is my before number, my total. So 20% of 75 equals what number? That's what we're solving for. We want to know what number is left. So 20% of 75, we just do 75 times 0.2, which is just 15. So we know that they gave away 15. And then we could even go one step further and figure out how many they have left, because we know they had 75 and they gave away 15, and then you would know that they still have 60 thingamabobs. So that would be the number right here in that box. Example 3. Bo and Christy hide 600 raisins. And this is 60% more than they hid last month. This is their second month of hiding raisins. The ones from last month are probably really gross. How many raisins did they hide last month? Or we know that right now they hid 600 raisins. But what we're trying to find is how many they hid last month. So before is the amount from last month. I'm going to write LM because we don't know how many they hid last month. But we know that after they hid 600 raisins. But 600 is actually 160%. And let me tell you why. Because before is always 100%. After, when they hid 60% more, I'm really adding 60% to the original, which they had 100% of their raisins, and then they hid 60% more. So my after makes it 160%, which is why I had to add on to my block here, because it's more than they had before. We're not decreasing in a percent, we are adding a percent. But this can still just be plugged right into our equation. So percent times of equals is. But what are we solving for? We want to know the of. We want to know how many they had last month. So that's what we're actually solving for. We know what percent more in this month. It was 160% more, which can be turned into a decimal, and it's just 1.6. And we're going to multiply that by our of, which we don't know. That's what we want to know. It's 160% of last month's amount, which we're solving for, equals this month's amount, which was 600. Now all we have to do is solve. In order to get that LM alone, we're going to divide by 1.6 over here. Cancel those out. Divide by 1.6 over here. And then LM equals 375 raisins. So they sold 375 raisins last month, but this month they sold 160% more, 1.6 times the amount as last month. And that would give me the answer of 600 raisins this month. So I checked my work and all was well.